Today in this video, we're going to discuss some terminology so that we can make sure that we're all using the same words and ideas when we're discussing materials when it comes to 3D models and working with games. The first thing I would like to discuss is the difference between what a shader is and what a material is. So we have been working with shaders in Maya. When we have an object that we need to put a material on, we usually do our right click and we do a assign new material. What this pop-up is and what we are choosing over here on the right is actually a type of shader. A shader is just a piece of code that will help define what the surface is going to look like. So it's more of kind of like, it's not like there's nothing defined in it. It is the actual code that somebody wrote to help determine, how this displays. A material, on the other hand, utilizes that shader with different settings to make a specific sort of look. So we can think of the shader almost like the blueprint of it, and then the material itself is a container of all the settings for that shader. So for instance, this is a Lambert shader on here, but I'm going to rename this material to be called chest_matte because it is actually a material. So the material itself is a collection of different settings that can define how the 3D engine, either in Maya or something like Unity, Unreal, or Sketchfab, display the surface of the model. So for instance, changing the color of this, changes, the surface of it. And, that's what all of these settings are. So again, shader is the code that is used as a blueprint, and the material itself is the actual collection of different settings used to change the look of a specific thing. So now that we know what those two are, what is the difference between a material and a texture? Because those are two different things. Textures can be a part of a material, but a material doesn't necessarily need a texture. When in Maya, we choose our file to display on our model, this is us choosing a texture. So for instance, if I decide I want to drop on this wood texture, the image of the wood is the texture. The material utilizes the texture in one of its settings. So before I put this on, that material just had on it that reddish color, and that's fine because materials don't necessarily need textures, but a texture needs a material. We can have a texture for our color. If we go over to Substance Painter, we can see all the different textures that we usually use. That's why this is called texture set. We do our texture sets. Like, what do we have? We have our base color, we have our metallic, roughness, normal, height. These can also be referred to as texture maps, since they are, usually we put it on a unwrapped UV map. So this would be the base color map, the metallic map, the roughness map, the normal map, and the height map. All of those together are in our material to create this finalized look. So materials choose a shader, which is a piece of code to help determine, what its look is. The material is the container that can hold onto things like textures for all of the different channels it has. But let's go a little bit deeper and discuss different types of textures that we can have. We've worked with a couple of them. The first type I would like to discuss is something like our wood floor. Our wood floor is what we would consider a tileable texture. This might also be called a seamless texture. The idea behind a tileable or seamless texture is that if we were to repeat it, either horizontal or vertical, it naturally tiles in all directions. So it's seamless. It doesn't look like it ends. We can utilize these on larger spaces like floors so that it looks like we have a giant wood floor where we don't have any noticeable, stoppage of it in either direction. So a tileable texture, if you say you're using a tileable texture or a seamless texture, the connotation is that it does tile seamlessly in both directions. The other type of texture that we have discussed is something called a trim sheet. Going back to this one, this is a good example of a trim sheet where we do expect some tileability, but it is not tiled in both directions. Generally, a trim sheet is tiled horizontally. So we see we have this nice strip of wood that would be tileable this way. This bronze tileable this way, and this pattern is tileable in this direction. There is no expectation that trim sheets should be tiled also in this direction. Sometimes it does work out that way, depending on the what exactly is on there. Like you might be able to have a little bit of bleed over for one or the other, but I would not anticipate a trim sheet being tileable the same way as a tileable texture. The other term you might remember or hear being talked about when talking about different types of textures is the idea of a texture atlas. The idea behind a texture atlas is that it is multiple different textures that you might use on either a larger object or multiple objects put onto a single texture like this. So for instance, this building, we have the door, we have the flag, we have the windows, and we do have, this piece up here. But usually the connotation with a texture atlas is that there is minimal to no tiling. There might be some. A lot of this terminology is very loose, but a lot of times if you mention that you're using a texture atlas to another 3D artist, they're going to assume probably that the tileability is minimal on your texture atlas. That isn't to say that there isn't a little bit of bleed over. Trim sheets, for instance, can also have some characteristics of a texture atlas. So for instance, this object right here is still usually considered a trim sheet because it does have all of this tileability, but it does have these one-off detail pieces that could be used to create a building. So, the language between, what's the difference between a trim sheet versus a texture atlas. Generally, a trim sheet should have a lot more tileability on it compared to a texture atlas. Here is another good example of a texture atlas where we can see there's a lot of little individual kind of pieces on here, and the tileability is very minimal from, side to size. Here is another good example of a trim sheet where we can see the majority of it is tileable horizontally, but down here we do have some little individual pieces that aren't tileable but are associated with this trim sheet. So hopefully you have found this video to be useful. It's really important to understand terminology. So again, shaders are the code that make up materials, because materials choose a shader to help it display, itself in 3D game engine. A material is a collection of various settings which may or may not include textures. Textures are images such as your base color, your normal map, your roughness map, your metallic map. Your textures can be of different types. It can just be a plain old, UV unwrapped texture. It can be a tileable or seamless texture. It can be a trim sheet, which is not tileable in all directions, but should be in at least one. And you also have your texture atlases, which usually do not have that much tileability on them. It might have a minimum amount, but generally it is not meant to be tileable. It is a collection of smaller pieces. But don't forget that trim sheets can also have some areas on it that might have a little bit of non-tileable pieces that go along with the tileable trim.